Marcus watched his dog, Scout, refuse every command. The usually obedient German Shepherd was fixated on a single empty wall in the old station master's office, constantly scratching at the plaster and letting out sharp, demanding barks. Marcus had already debunked the station's ghosts, proving the phantom train whistle was just the wind. He thought the mysteries were over. He tried to pull the dog away, convinced it was just a mouse, but Scout stubbornly refused to move. The dog's desperate eyes told him this was something more, a secret sealed away behind the solid wall, a truth that had been silent for nearly 100 years. Marcus thought he was just restoring a building, but he was about to break through into a past that someone had tried very hard to bury forever. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. The silence in the small apartment was a heavy, shapeless thing. It pooled in the corners, clung to the sparse furniture, and filled the spaces between the slow, deliberate ticks of the wall clock. Marcus sat in a worn armchair, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on nothing. He was a tall man, lean in a way that spoke of hard-earned muscle rather than want, with short brown hair that was beginning to surrender to distinguish silver at the temples. His face, framed by a short, thick beard, was a roadmap of a life lived intensely. It was weathered and etched with lines of fatigue, but a fundamental kindness still resided in the set of his jaw and the quiet depth of his gray eyes. For a former combat medic, his stillness was unnatural. It was the stillness of a machine powered down, waiting for an order that would never come. Lying at his feet, with a heavy sigh that seemed to echo Marcus's own unspoken thoughts, was Scout. He was a German Shepherd of about 5 years, his magnificent coat a thick blend of slate gray and pale white, like a wolf caught in winter twilight. Scout was a calm and intelligent animal, his amber eyes rarely leaving his human. He felt the oppressive silence not as an absence of noise, but as a presence, a weight on his master's soul that he could not nudge away with his wet nose or chase off with a playful bark. He had seen Marcus through the violent cacophony of war and now watched over him in the disquieting peace that followed. The jarring buzz of the apartment intercom was a violation. Scout's head shot up, a low rumble vibrating in his chest. Marcus blinked slowly, as if surfacing from a great depth. He pressed the button. A tinny voice announced a certified letter. A few minutes later, a stiff, cream-colored envelope was in his hands, bearing the insignia of a law firm he had never heard of. His fingers, so steady under fire, fumbled slightly with the seal. The letter was dense with legal jargon, but the words that mattered leaped from the page, sharp and brutal. Sergeant Thomas Miller, retired, had passed away peacefully from a heart condition. Marcus felt a hollow punch to his gut. Miller had been more than his commander. He had been the steadfast rock in the chaotic storm of Marcus's youth, a mentor who had shaped him, a father figure in all but blood. And then came the second blow, the one that made no sense. As Sergeant Miller's sole heir, Marcus was now the owner of his entire estate, an estate which, the letter clarified, consisted of a single asset, the old Harmony Creek Central Station, a decommissioned train station in Miller's hometown in the fading industrial heartland of Pennsylvania. The drive east was a blur of gray highways and rust-colored hills. Harmony Creek was much like the other towns they passed through, a place that seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for a prosperity that had left decades ago and showed no signs of returning. The storefronts on Main Street were a mix of resilient small businesses and boarded-up failures. A local agent, a brisk woman named Ms. Gable, who handled affairs for the out-of-town law firm, met him in front of the station. She had a sympathetic but businesslike air, handing him a large, heavy ring of iron keys. "It's quite the property," she said, her voice betraying a hint of pity. "A local landmark. Hasn't seen a passenger since the 1970s. When she drove away, Marcus was left alone with Scout, facing the legacy he never asked for. The station was a colossal stone skeleton. It was a magnificent building, born of an era of ambition and industry, with grand arched windows that were now dark and vacant, and ornate stone carvings of eagles and wreaths that were choked with ivy. But it was a beauty in decay. Bricks were missing, the roof sagged in places, and a profound loneliness emanated from its very stones. It wasn't a project. It was a tombstone for a forgotten time. What in the world was he supposed to do with it? The main key groaned in the lock, the sound of a giant stirring from a long sleep. The doors swung inward, revealing the main concourse, a cathedral of silence and dust. Sunlight streamed in through the high, dirty windows, illuminating floating motes of dust like tiny constellations. The vast, empty space echoed with the ghosts of a million farewells and a million greetings. The grand clock on the far wall was frozen at 3:30. Scout stayed close to his side, his claws clicking softly on the marble floor, his ears swiveling to catch the faint sounds of the wind whistling through broken panes of glass. They explored slowly, room by empty room, until they found the station master's office. It was less disturbed than the rest of the station, a space of quiet importance. A heavy oak desk sat facing the door, covered in a thick shroud of dust. On its surface, placed dead center, was a simple, sealed envelope with a single word written on it in a familiar, strong hand. Marcus. His heart hammered against his ribs. He sat down in the creaking leather chair, the ghost of 1,000 commands and conversations swirling in the air around him. He opened the letter. "Marcus," it began, "if you're reading this, then my old ticker finally gave out. Don't you dare get somber on me, son. I had a good run. I'm writing this because I've left you something of a mess, and I owe you an explanation. This old station has been in my family for a long, long time. It was more than just a place of work for us. It was our heart. My great-grandfather was the station master here. His name was Samuel Miller. He was a good man, a proud man. He died here in the great train crash of 1923. The official story was a faulty track switch, a tragic accident. But my grandfather never believed it. He said Samuel had been worried about something, that he was getting ready to expose something dangerous. But whatever it was, it died with him. The story became a local legend, and our family's questions became a quiet, unanswered grief. I spent years trying to find an answer, but I was always looking in the wrong places. I'm too old now, and this place holds too many ghosts for me. But you see things other people miss. You know how to look past the noise and find what's real. I couldn't save my great-grandfather, Marcus, just like I know you carry the weight of the men you couldn't save. But maybe, just maybe, you can find the truth. I don't know what's here. Maybe nothing. But this is my last request. Before you sell this place to be torn down for scrap, just look. See what you can find. I couldn't find the answers, but I believe you can. Find yourself a new mission here, Marcus." Marcus read the letter 3 times, the words blurring through a film of unexpected tears. The inheritance was not a property. It was a burden, a mystery, a sacred trust. He was no longer just an aimless veteran. He was the last soldier in Sergeant Miller's long war. As night fell, he and Scout made a small camp in the station master's office. Marcus laid out his old army sleeping bag on the floor, the vast dark emptiness of the station pressing in on him. The wind moaned through the building's broken bones. In the oppressive silence, his mind drifted back, as it so often did, to the dust and shouts of a field hospital, to the faces of boys he had held as their lives slipped away. He closed his eyes, the familiar ache of loss settling in his chest, and then he heard it. It started as a low, mournful hum, seeming to rise from the very stones beneath him. It grew louder, clearer, coalescing into a sound that was impossible yet unmistakable. The long, sorrowful wail of a steam train's whistle. It echoed through the cavernous hall, a lonely, ghostly cry that spoke of journeys unfinished and destinations never reached. Marcus sat bolt upright, his skin cold. Every rational instinct screamed that it was just the wind, a trick of acoustics in the cavernous building. But this was too clear, too specific. Scout was on his feet in an instant, but he wasn't barking or growling in fear. His ears were pricked forward, his head cocked, a low, inquisitive whine escaping his throat. He looked at the closed office door, then back at Marcus, his intelligent eyes filled not with terror but with intense, focused curiosity. The sound faded, leaving a silence that was deeper and more profound than before. It was a silence filled with a question. The mission had begun. The last echo of the impossible whistle dissolved into the cavernous dark, and a silence that was heavier than before rushed back in to fill the void. Marcus sat frozen on his sleeping bag, every muscle tensed. His rational mind scrambled for purchase, offering explanations like a frantic salesman. It was the wind. Of course it was the wind, forcing its way through some forgotten pipe or broken window, its passage through the station's decaying guts, twisting it into a perfect, mournful mimicry of a steam whistle. It had to be. Trains had not run on these tracks for half a century. Beside him, Scout had not relaxed. The German shepherd remained standing, a statue of taut attention, his gaze fixed on the office door, as if he could see the sound still lingering in the hall beyond. There was no fear in his posture, only an intense analytical curiosity. He let out a soft, low whine, a sound of pure inquiry, before finally glancing at Marcus, his amber eyes asking a clear question. "Did you hear that, too?" Marcus reached out a hand and stroked the dog's powerful neck. "It's nothing, boy," he whispered. The words meant more for himself than for his companion. Just the wind in an old house. The next morning, under the clear light of day, the ghostly sound seemed like a trick of an exhausted mind. Marcus pushed it away and focused on the tangible. He was a man who understood process, who found comfort in tasks. The station was an overwhelming mess, but any mess could be conquered if you broke it down into small, manageable pieces. He started with the station master's office. He swept away decades of dust, the rhythmic scrape of the broom on the wooden floor a comforting, solid sound. He found a stack of old shipping manifests, their cursive script elegant and faded, and piled them neatly on the desk. He was imposing order, creating a small island of control in an ocean of decay and uncertainty. During the day, it was almost possible to believe that this was all the inheritance was. A massive, dilapidated building project. A challenge of labor and logistics. He could focus on the loose floorboards, the cracked plaster, the windows that needed boarding up. He could almost convince himself that Miller had simply left him a project to keep his hands busy, a place to channel the restless energy that had no outlet in his quiet, post-military life. But when dusk began to bleed through the tall, grimy windows, the character of the station changed. The shadows grew long and deep, and the silence returned, filled with anticipation. And with the darkness, the sounds returned. It was not just the whistle. This time, it was followed by a long, metallic screech, the agonizing sound of immense weight grinding against steel. It was the sound of a train's wheels locking on tracks that were no longer there. Night after night, the phantom train made its presence known. The mournful whistle would echo through the concourse, followed by the tortured shriek of its wheels. The sounds were always the same, a ghostly reenactment of a final, desperate moment. And with each nightly performance, Marcus felt his resolve crumble. The station stopped feeling like a project and began to feel like a wound. It was a place saturated with loss, its very air thick with the memory of a violent end. It reminded him too much of other places, of tents filled with the metallic scent of blood and the quiet, pleading whispers of men he was trying to hold together. The internal battle raged. One moment he would be rereading Miller's letter, his commander's words a call to duty he could not ignore. The responsibility felt heavy and real. He owed it to the old man to see this through, to find the truth he had sought. But then, in the deep of the night, with the phantom sounds echoing around him, the desire to flee would become overwhelming. He could call Miss Gable, he could sign some papers, take whatever money the land was worth, and just walk away. He could go back to his silent apartment, back to a life that was empty, but at least free of ghosts, both new and old. This place was a tomb, and he had spent too much of his life in tombs. Throughout this turmoil, Scout remained his one fixed point. The dog's reaction to the spectral sounds never wavered. While Marcus paced or sat with his head in his hands, Scout would rise with a quiet dignity. His ears would prick, his body would tense with interest, and he would walk with deliberate purpose to a single spot. A heavy, dark oak door at the far end of the main hall, set back in a small alcove. He would stand before it, sniffing at the crack along the bottom. He never barked aggressively. Instead, he would let out that same low, questioning whine and sometimes scratch lightly at the wood with one of his big paws. Then he would turn his head and look directly at Marcus, his gaze steady and unequivocal. He was not afraid. He was not threatened. He was simply and stubbornly indicating a direction. He was a guide, pointing the way into the heart of the mystery. The sounds came from the station at large, but Scout's focus was always, single-mindedly, on that one door. It was the door, he seemed to be saying, that led to the answers. After nearly a week of this, Marcus was worn down. He was sleep-deprived, his nerves frayed by the nightly haunting and his own internal war. He sat on the floor of the concourse, leaning against a cold marble pillar, watching as Scout once again took up his patient vigil by the oak door. The whistle blew its mournful tune through the empty space, and Scout whined in response, nudging the door with his nose. Marcus looked at his dog, truly looked at him. He saw no fear, no anxiety, only a calm and unwavering sense of purpose. Scout trusted his senses. He heard a sound, identified a source of interest, and was determined to investigate. It was simple. It was pure. In the face of the unknown, the dog's response was not to retreat, but to advance with curiosity. In that moment, Marcus felt a profound sense of shame. He, the trained soldier, the man who had faced down death, was cowering from a noise in an empty building. He was letting his own ghosts paralyze him, and his dog, his fearless, loyal companion, was trying to show him the way forward. He was trying to lead him not into danger, but toward a mission, toward the mission Miller had entrusted to him. Running away from this station would be just another retreat, another failure to face what was right in front of him. Slowly, Marcus got to his feet, his joints stiff. He walked over to his pack in the office and pulled out a heavy, military-grade flashlight. He checked the batteries, the familiar heft of the object, a small comfort in his hand. He walked back into the hall, his boots echoing with a new resolve. Scout watched him approach the door, a hopeful look in his eyes, his tail giving a single, expectant thump against the floor. Marcus reached out and rested his hand on Scout's head. "All right, boy," Marcus said, his voice raspy but firm. "You win." He looked at the dark, imposing door. It led down, into the earth, into the station's foundations, where the secrets were buried. He took a deep breath, the air tasting of dust and cold stone. "Let's go see your ghost." With his free hand, he reached for the cold iron handle of the basement door and turned it. The old oak door groaned open, complaining loudly as it broke a seal of decades-old disuse. A wave of cold, heavy air rolled out, carrying the scent of damp earth, chilled stone, and the faint metallic tang of rust. It was the smell of a place that had not seen sunlight in a very long time. Marcus clicked on his flashlight, its powerful beam cutting a sharp cone through the oppressive darkness, revealing a set of steep stone steps descending into blackness. Scout, without a moment's hesitation, trotted past him and down the stairs, his paws making soft, confident sounds on the stone. With a deep breath, Marcus followed his fearless guide. The basement was enormous, far larger than he had anticipated. It was a subterranean labyrinth of thick stone pillars, forgotten alcoves, and the hulking, silent shapes of old machinery. A massive, disconnected boiler sat like a slumbering iron beast in one corner. In another, piles of discarded railway parts lay in chaotic heaps, slowly surrendering to rust. A web of pipes of varying sizes snaked across the low ceiling and down the walls, a circulatory system for a body that was no longer alive. Scout moved through the space with purpose, his nose to the ground, sniffing intently, but giving no specific signal. The air was still and tomb-like. The phantom train was silent. They spent over an hour exploring, the beam of Marcus's flashlight their only anchor in the disorienting dark. But without the sounds to guide them, it was a pointless search. He was looking for a ghost in a graveyard, with no idea which grave to check. The mystery was not in the space itself, but in the building's very structure, in its bones and arteries. He needed to understand how it was built, how it breathed. He needed blueprints. The Harmony Creek Public Library was a small, proud brick building, one of the few on Main Street that seemed to be actively defying the town's slow decline. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and wood polish. The silence here was different from the station's. It was a peaceful, scholarly quiet. A man sat behind the main circulation desk, his head bent over a large, open book. He was elderly, with a cloud of thin, white hair and a face deeply lined with the patient concentration of a lifelong reader. He wore a tweed jacket with worn leather patches on the elbows and looked up over a pair of gold-rimmed spectacles as Marcus approached. "Can I help you?" His voice was reedy but clear. "I hope so," Marcus began. "My name is Marcus Thorne. I'm the new owner of the old Central Station. I was hoping you might have the original blueprints or architectural plans for the building." The librarian's eyebrows rose slightly. He took off his glasses, letting them hang from a cord around his neck, and studied Marcus with sharp, intelligent eyes. This was Mr. Abernathy, the town's unofficial historian and the fiercely protective guardian of its memory. "The station?" he said, his tone laced with a distinct skepticism. "That's a big piece of history for an outsider to take on. Most folks around here just wish someone would tear it down. What's your interest in the blueprints?" "I'm just trying to understand the structure before I begin any restoration work," Marcus said, offering a partial truth. "Plumbing, ventilation, electrical conduits. I want to know what I'm dealing with." Abernathy continued to study him for a long moment, a gatekeeper deciding if this stranger was worthy of entry into the town's past. "The Miller estate," he finally said, more to himself than to Marcus. "Tom Miller was a good man. His family has deep roots here." He seemed to make a decision. "All right, Mr. Thorne. It's a public record after all, but they're fragile. The originals are in the town archive, but I have copies on microfiche." He led Marcus to a clunky beige machine in the corner and spent 20 minutes patiently showing him how to use it, his initial skepticism slowly being replaced by the quiet excitement of a historian sharing his passion. Marcus scrolled through the images, the ghostly white lines of the blueprints glowing on the screen. He found what he needed, detailed schematics of the station's substructure, including the complex network of pipes in the basement. Back at the station, armed with printouts of the blueprints, Marcus's second descent into the basement felt different. It was no longer a ghost hunt, it was an investigation. Scout seemed to sense the change, staying close by his side as Marcus spread the papers on a dusty crate, using his flashlight to trace the lines. He identified the main water lines, the old heating pipes, and a large central ventilation shaft that the plans indicated connected to the city's old original sewer system. As if on cue, the sound began. The low, mournful hum that grew into the full-throated wail of the steam whistle. It was just as chilling as before, but this time, Marcus was at ground zero. The sound was all around them, vibrating through the stone. Scout's ears shot up, and he looked expectantly at Marcus. "Okay, boy, let's go," Marcus said, his voice low and focused. He grabbed the flashlight and the blueprints and moved toward the sound. It was coming from the direction of the main ventilation shaft. He followed the schematics, navigating the maze of pillars until he stood before a huge, cast-iron pipe that rose from the floor to the ceiling. The wail was loudest here, emanating directly from the metal. He ran his hand over its cold, grimy surface, and then he felt it. A steady, strong draft of air coming from a narrow, jagged fissure in the pipe, a crack that was almost invisible in the dark. He shone the light on the blueprints again, his finger tracing the line. The pipe went down, connecting to the sprawling, tunnel-like sewer system beneath the town. He finally understood. When the wind blew from a certain direction, it would rush through the network of tunnels under Harmony Creek, and a portion of that air was forced up this shaft. When it passed through the unique shape of that fissure, It created a perfect, resonant frequency, a giant, earthbound flute, playing a single, sorrowful note. Just as the whistle began to fade, the other sound started, the grating, metallic screech. It was more distant, echoing from above. He and Scout hurried back up the stone steps. The sound was louder in the main concourse, seeming to come from the high vaulted ceiling. He took the flashlight and went outside, circling the massive building. On the western-facing side of the roof, battered by the prevailing winds, he found the second culprit. A large section of decorative metal siding had come loose from its moorings. As the wind gusted, it would lift the heavy sheet and scrape it along the rusted iron of the main rain gutter. The grating, screeching sound it produced was amplified and distorted by the station's cavernous halls, mimicking the terrible sound of a train's locking wheels. He stood there for a long time in the wind, looking at the loose piece of metal, and then back at the silent, hulking station. The curse was broken. The ghosts were gone, exposed for what they were, just wind and decay, sad tricks played by a lonely, falling-apart building. He felt no disappointment. Instead, a profound sense of relief and accomplishment washed over him. He had faced the unknown, the thing that had tormented him and preyed on his deepest fears of loss, and he had defeated it, not with force, but with logic and patience. It was the first time in years he had felt truly in control, the first time he had felt a clear sense of purpose. He went back inside and found Scout sitting peacefully in the middle of the hall as if his work was done. Marcus knelt and wrapped his arms around the dog's neck, burying his face in the thick gray fur. "You were right all along, buddy," he murmured. "You knew there was an answer." That afternoon, he didn't think about selling. He didn't think about leaving. He found the old broom he had used before, and he started in the corner of the great hall, sweeping away a century of dust and neglect. It was a small, almost insignificant action against the sheer scale of the decay, but it was a start. It was the first step in restoring Sergeant Miller's legacy. The nights were quiet now. The phantom train had made its final run, its ghostly whistle and screeching wheels banished by the simple, mundane truth of wind and rust. With the haunting gone, a new kind of silence settled over the station, one that was peaceful rather than menacing. It was the quiet of a place at rest, waiting patiently for a new purpose. For Marcus, the silence was a gift. It allowed him to work during the day and sleep soundly at night, the ghosts of the battlefield finally held at bay by sheer physical exhaustion and a clear, tangible mission. Weeks bled into a month. The progress was slow, a single man's effort against a century of neglect, but it was real. The great concourse was now free of the worst of the debris. He had boarded up the broken windows, silencing the mournful drafts. He had even managed to repair a section of the leaking roof, stopping the relentless drip of water that had stained the marble floors. Each small victory, each task completed, was a quiet affirmation of his decision to stay. He was not just cleaning a building, he was honoring a legacy. He decided to make the station master's office his base of operations. It was a defensible space, manageable in size, and it felt like the heart of the old station. It was here that he had read Miller's letter, here that the mission had truly begun. The grand oak desk had been cleared and polished, its rich wood gleaming for the first time in decades. But the rest of the room was still cluttered with the detritus of the past. In the corner stood a tall, heavy four-drawer filing cabinet made of steel, painted an institutional green. It was likely empty, but it was taking up valuable space, and Marcus decided it had to be moved to the opposite wall. The cabinet was heavier than it looked, its legs fused to the wooden floor by years of inertia and grime. Marcus put his shoulder into it, grunting with effort. The cabinet groaned in protest, its metal feet scraping a painful scar into the floorboards as he slowly, inch by inch, began to pivot it away from the wall. He gave one final, powerful shove. The back leg of the cabinet snagged on a raised floorboard and scraped hard against the plaster wall behind it. There was a dull crack, and a dinner plate-sized chunk of the old, brittle plaster broke loose and crumbled to the floor in a shower of white dust. "Just what I needed," Marcus muttered to himself, surveying the damage. Another repair on the list. Scout had been dozing in a patch of sunlight by the door, but at the sound of the crumbling plaster, he was instantly awake and on his feet. His reaction was immediate and absolute. His head went up, his black nose twitching, testing the air. He took a few steps forward, his body low to the ground, and began to sniff intently at the newly exposed patch of lath and the dusty pile of plaster fragments on the floor. A low whine, the same sound of intense inquiry Marcus had heard in the basement, rumbled in the dog's chest. He pushed his nose right into the hole, sniffing with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The air, disturbed for the first time in nearly 100 years, had released a complex cocktail of scents, a story told in molecules. It was a story of dry, decaying paper, of the faint, sweet musk of a leather-bound book, and the sharp metallic tang of oxidized iron, a symphony of smells completely alien to the simple palette of plaster and wood. "Easy, boy," Marcus said, walking over. "It's just a wall." Scout ignored him. His investigation grew more frantic. He began to paw at the edge of the hole, his big claws scraping against the lath, sending more dust into the air. The whining grew louder, more insistent. Then he did something he rarely did. He let out a single, sharp, demanding bark. It wasn't a warning or a playful yip. It was a bark of command, of urgent communication. Marcus frowned. "Hey, knock it off. There's nothing there. It's probably just a mouse nest." He reached down and took hold of Scout's collar, trying to gently pull him away. But the dog resisted, planting his feet firmly, his muscles tense. He refused to be moved, his entire being focused on that one spot on the wall. He barked again, looking back at Marcus with an expression of profound frustration, as if he couldn't believe his human was being so dense. For the next hour, the pattern continued. Marcus would try to go back to work, and Scout would return to the wall, scratching and whining with relentless persistence. Marcus's patience began to wear thin. He was a man on a mission, and this was a distraction. He raised his voice, using the firm tone he rarely had to employ with his well-trained companion. "Scout, that's enough. Leave it." For a moment, the dog would obey, walking away from the wall with his head lowered, his tail tucked. He would lie down by the desk, but his eyes never left the spot. His body was still, but his mind was not. The moment Marcus turned his back, Scout would be up again, returning to his obsessive task. It was this uncharacteristic disobedience that finally made Marcus pause. He stopped his work and just watched. He saw the fierce, unwavering concentration in the dog's eyes. He saw the way every muscle in his body was focused on a single, invisible goal. This was not a game. This was not a chase. This was work. And then he remembered. He remembered the nights of the ghostly sounds, his own fear and rationalizations, and Scout's calm, stubborn insistence. He remembered how the dog had led him again and again to the basement door, guided by a certainty that Marcus himself had lacked. Scout had been right then, right in a way that defied simple explanation. He had trusted his dog's instincts in the basement, and it had led him to the truth. How could he not trust him now? He walked over and knelt on the floor beside his dog. Scout stopped scratching and looked at him, panting softly, as if to say, "Finally, you're listening." Marcus reached out and ran his hand down Scout's back, feeling the tense muscles. He looked at the hole in the wall. To his eyes, it was nothing, just broken plaster and old wooden slats. But to Scout, it was a gateway. It was a signpost, as clear and obvious as the basement door had been. The frustration and annoyance drained away from Marcus, replaced by a familiar, prickling sense of anticipation. The station had given up one of its secrets. Now, it seemed, it was ready to give up another. He placed his hand on the wall next to the hole, the old plaster cool and solid beneath his palm. He looked from the wall to his dog, a silent understanding passing between them. "Okay, boy," Marcus said softly, his voice full of a new respect. "I'm listening." He leaned closer, his eyes tracing the cracks around the hole. "What did you find?" Trust had been forged in the echoing silence of the station's long nights and proven in the dusty darkness of its basement. Marcus now knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that Scout was not just a dog, but a diviner of hidden things. He knelt beside his companion, the two of them a silent tableau of man and animal, partners in a mission that was growing stranger by the hour. Marcus ran his hand over the wall, his fingers tracing the edges of the hole. He pressed gently, then knocked with his knuckles. The sound was different here, not the solid thud of plaster over brick, but a hollow, resonant echo. There was a space behind it. But a hollow space did not necessarily mean a hidden treasure. It could be a collapsed chimney flue, an old service conduit, or simply a quirk of the original construction. Taking a sledgehammer to the station's interior, based solely on a dog's intuition and a hollow sound, felt reckless. He was here to restore Miller's legacy, not to punch holes in it without cause. He needed more. He needed context. He needed to know if there was any historical reason, any whisper of a rumor that might suggest something was deliberately hidden in this office. There was only one person in town who might know. The bell above the library door chimed softly as Marcus entered for the second time. Mr. Abernathy was in the same spot, but this time he looked up with a glimmer of recognition, not suspicion. "Mr. Thorne," the old historian said, a note of curiosity in his voice. "Back so soon? I hope the blueprints were of some use in taming your mechanical ghosts." "They were, thank you," Marcus replied, approaching the desk. "They helped me solve that mystery completely. But now I have a different kind of question, a more delicate one." Marcus decided on the truth, or at least a version of it that didn't involve a dog's supernatural sense of smell. He told Abernathy about Miller's letter, about the revelation that his great-grandfather was Samuel Miller, the station master who had died in the crash of 1923. He spoke of Miller's belief that it had not been an accident. As Marcus spoke, Mr. Abernathy's entire demeanor changed. The detached scholarly curiosity vanished, replaced by a deep professional intensity. He leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "I always wondered about that," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. The official report was so neat, so tidy. A single faulty switch, case closed. But there were always stories, rumors that the old families in town preferred not to repeat. "What kind of rumors?" Marcus pressed, his heart beating a little faster. "It was nothing you could ever prove," Abernathy cautioned. "Whispers. Talk that Samuel had been seen arguing with a foreman from one of the big steel companies a few days before the crash. Rumors that he was a meticulous man who would never have let a switch go uninspected. The local paper at the time printed the official report, of course, but it also ran a surprisingly emotional obituary that hinted he was a man under great pressure." "Do you still have those papers?" Mr. Abernathy gave a thin, decisive nod. The gatekeeper had decided Marcus was worthy. He disappeared into the archives in the back, the staff-only door swinging shut behind him. He returned 10 minutes later, carrying a large, flat archival box. With careful, reverent hands, he lifted out several yellowed, brittle newspapers from the autumn of 1923. He spread them out on the table. The headlines were stark. "Tragedy at Harmony Creek Station," one screamed. "Dozens perish in derailment." And there, on an inside page, was the obituary. It described Samuel Miller as a devoted husband and father, and a station master of unimpeachable integrity. Marcus's eyes snagged on the final sentence. He carried the weight of this station on his shoulders, and it is a tragedy beyond measure that he was taken from us so suddenly, before he could see his final duties through. Before he could see his final duties through. It was a subtle, cryptic phrase, but now, filtered through the lens of Miller's letter, it felt like a shout. "Thank you, Mr. Abernathy," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "This is more help than you know." "The past is never truly dead, Mr. Thorne," the historian said, his eyes gleaming with a shared purpose. "It's just waiting for the right person to come along and listen." Marcus returned to the station with a new fire in his belly. The hollow space in the wall was no longer just a curiosity. It was a possibility, a place where a man under great pressure might hide something to see his final duties through. He retrieved a heavy sledgehammer and a long steel crowbar from his truck. Scout, sensing the shift in Marcus's intent, began to whine excitedly, his tail thumping a rapid rhythm against the floor. "Okay, stay back, boy," Marcus commanded, and the dog dutifully retreated to the doorway, watching with rapt attention. Marcus took his stance, the weight of the sledgehammer feeling solid and real in his hands. He swung. The first blow was deafening in the quiet office, a concussive boom that sent a spiderweb of cracks through the plaster. He swung again and again, breaking through the surface and revealing the wooden lath beneath. He used the crowbar to pry the lath away, the dry wood splintering easily. Behind the lath was not another wall, but a solid layer of dark, old brick. It was different from the exterior brick of the station, laid more crudely. It was a patch, a seal. This part of the wall had been opened up and then sealed again, long ago. With a surge of adrenaline, he set the hammer against the brick. The work was harder now, each blow sending jarring vibrations up his arms. Brick dust filled the air, thick and chalky. He worked methodically, creating a hole in the center, then expanding it outwards. After 10 minutes of grueling work, he broke through the last brick. He paused, breathing heavily, and peered into the darkness beyond. There was a space about 3 feet deep, and in that space there was something else. He grabbed his flashlight, its beam cutting through the dust-filled air. And there it was. Set back into the cavity, squat and immovable, was a safe. It was a black iron box, perhaps 2 feet square, its face dominated by a single, large combination dial, the numbers faded but still legible. The maker's name, Excelsior Safe and Lock Co., was embossed in ornate but tarnished brass above the dial. It was a relic from another time, a silent iron guardian that had held its post within the wall, waiting in the dark for nearly 100 years. Marcus lowered the sledgehammer, a sense of profound awe washing over him. Scout crept forward, sniffing at the opening, and let out a single, satisfied bark. The hunt was over. The secret had been found. Marcus stared at the safe, at the inert object that held the truth his commander had spent a lifetime searching for. He understood now, with chilling clarity, that he was no longer just a man fixing up an old building. He was standing on the edge of a great precipice, about to uncover a truth that had the power to rewrite the history of this town, for better or for worse. The silence he had been tasked with breaking was not the silence of an empty station, but the silence of a long-buried crime. The safe stood in the dusty cavity of the wall like a dark, stubborn heart. It was a tangible link to the past, a vessel of secrets, but it was sealed tight. Marcus ran his hands over its cold iron surface. The combination dial, a heavy brass wheel of faded numbers, stared back at him, its code lost to time. He was a medic, skilled at mending the human body, but the intricate mechanics of a century-old lock were a language he did not speak. For a moment, he was tempted to use the sledgehammer again, to answer this silent challenge with brute force. But that felt wrong. This safe had been placed with care, meant to protect its contents. Destroying it would be a desecration. He needed an expert, a specialist in the forgotten arts of springs and tumblers. The next morning, he and Scout drove into town. After asking for directions at the local hardware store, he found his way to a small, cluttered shop on a side street. A simple wooden sign, its paint flaking, read, "Vance & Son, Locksmiths." The & Son had been painted over long ago. Inside, the shop smelled of metal shavings and oil. It was a museum of security, with locks and keys from every era hanging on the walls. Behind the counter sat a man who seemed as much a relic as his inventory. He was thin and stooped, with large, gnarled hands that looked far too big for his frail frame. His name was Elias Vance, and his eyes, magnified by thick glasses, were pale blue and missed nothing. Marcus explained his situation, omitting the details of the wall, but describing the Excelsior safe with as much precision as he could. Mr. Vance listened patiently, his head tilted. "An old Excelsior," he said when Marcus was finished, his voice a dry rustle. They built them to last, not like the tin cans they sell today. You can't force it. You have to listen to it. You have to feel it. Not many people have the patience for that anymore. "Are you one of them?" Marcus asked. A slow, knowing smile spread across the old man's face. "I've been listening to Locke speak my entire life, son. Let's go take a look." Back at the station, Mr. Vance approached the safe with the quiet reverence of a priest at an altar. He ran his fingertips over the dial, then pressed a small, battered stethoscope to the iron door. Scout lay near the doorway, watching the strange ritual with intense curiosity. For the next hour, the only sounds in the office were the faint rhythmic clicks of the dial turning, the soft whisper of the old man's breathing, and the frantic beating of Marcus's own heart. Mr. Vance worked in a state of deep concentration, his head cocked, his eyes closed. He was not just hearing the lock, he was having a conversation with it. Finally, he stopped. He turned the handle with a slow, deliberate motion. There was a deep, resonant thunk, a sound of final surrender, as the heavy bolts retracted for the first time in nearly a century. "She's open," Mr. Vance said simply, wiping his hands on a rag. After paying the locksmith, who gave him a respectful nod and left without another word, Marcus was alone again with Scout and the secret. He pulled the heavy iron door open. The air that escaped from within was stale and dry. His flashlight beam revealed an interior that was empty, save for one object sitting in the center. A plain, rectangular tin box, its edges sealed with a dark, lumpy line of old solder. Samuel Miller had not just hidden his secrets in a safe, he had double protected them in a humble, airtight container. It was the careful act of a man who knew the value of what he was hiding and the lengths his enemies might go to find it. Using a crowbar, Marcus carefully pried the soldered lid off the tin box. Inside, nestled in the darkness, lay a small, leather-bound journal and a thin sheaf of folded papers. They were perfectly preserved, the paper yellowed with age, but not with damp, the leather dry, but not rotted. He lifted the journal out as if it were a sacred artifact. He sat down at the great oak desk, the same desk where Samuel Miller must have sat, and with Scout resting his heavy head on his knee, he began to read. The handwriting was a neat, disciplined cursive, the ink faded from black to a soft brown. The first entries were mundane, detailing weather patterns, cargo manifests, and staffing issues. But then the tone began to change. October 12, 1923, one entry read. Another argument with the foreman from Allegheny Steel. He insists the new axle couplings are sound, but I saw the cracks in the casting myself. They are cutting corners. I will not sign off on them. The safety of my men and my passengers is not negotiable. A few pages later, the words grew more urgent. October 19, 1923. I was offered a bonus, a substantial one. They called it a reward for my efficiency. I know it was a bribe. I refused it. The foreman looked at me in a way I did not like. There is a rot in this business, a rot that puts profit before lives. As Marcus read these words, the dusty office around him began to fade. The neat cursive on the page blurred, and for a moment he saw other faces, heard other voices. He saw the face of a 19-year-old corporal, a kid from Ohio who had bled out in his arms, his life lost not to a heroic charge, but to a faulty vehicle part that had been signed off on by a contractor thousands of miles away. He felt the phantom weight of a soldier he had tried to shield, lost to an explosion that never should have happened. These were the ghosts he lived with, the ones born from negligence and quiet, bureaucratic crimes. He turned the page. The final entry was dated the day before the crash. October 22, 1923. They are going to do it. I overheard them. The foreman and another man. They spoke of a permanent solution to the trackage dispute with the railroad competitor. They are going to stage an accident, a terrible one, and blame it on faulty equipment from the other line. My God, they will kill dozens to win a shipping contract. I have the delivery receipts showing their faulty parts and the correspondence refusing my safety reports. I cannot go to the authorities. The sheriff is in their pocket. I will hide this journal and the proof. If something happens to me, may God grant that an honest man finds this box. It is all I can do." Marcus closed his eyes. In the face of Samuel Miller, a man he had never met, he saw the faces of all the good men he had lost. He saw their honor, their quiet sense of duty, their shock at the senselessness of their end. The station master's lonely, principled stand against a corrupt and powerful system was the same fight, in a different uniform. His covered-up murder was the same casual disregard for human life that had haunted Marcus's every waking moment. He slowly closed the journal and placed his hands on its worn leather cover. The grief he felt was not just for a man who had died 100 years ago. It was for his commander, Sergeant Miller, who had carried this unanswered question his whole life. And it was for himself, for the pieces of his own soul he had left on dusty battlefields. The personal pain he had carried for so long, a solitary and heavy burden, now merged with the righteous anger of this historical crime. It flowed into a single, powerful current. This was no longer just a duty to a dead friend. It was no longer just a mystery to be solved. It had become a sacred mission. Finding justice for Samuel Miller was now a way to find a voice for all the silent, unjust deaths he had witnessed. It was a way to fight back. The morning after he read the journal, Marcus drove to a city 2 hours away. He walked into a small, quiet copy shop and spent the next 3 hours methodically photographing every single page of Samuel Miller's journal and every accompanying document. He then packaged the memory card into a padded envelope and sent it via registered mail to the only lawyer he trusted, a man he had served with, along with a letter detailing exactly what to do if he was not heard from within 1 week. It was a soldier's precaution, a necessary insurance policy before walking into a battle of a different kind. He was not just carrying a story now, he was carrying a weapon, and he had no intention of walking into the enemy's camp unarmed. The headquarters of Allegheny Consolidated Steel was a tower of smoked glass and polished chrome, a sterile, modern fortress that stood in stark contrast to the crumbling brick and stone of Harmony Creek. Marcus, dressed in a clean shirt and his worn denim jeans, felt profoundly out of place in the silent, opulent lobby. He was escorted to the top floor to a corner office with a panoramic view of the city below. Arthur Finch, the current CEO, and the great-grandson of the man who had orchestrated the crash of 1923, was exactly as Marcus had pictured. He was a man in his late 50s, dressed in an impeccably tailored gray suit, with silver hair and a face that was handsome, but etched with a permanent weary tension. He was polite, his handshake firm, his demeanor one of practiced corporate authority. He gestured for Marcus to sit in a leather chair that was likely worth more than his truck. Scout, who had been allowed to accompany him, lay down silently at Marcus's feet, a calm but watchful presence. "Mr. Thorne," Finch began, his voice smooth, "my office said you had a matter of some historical significance to discuss regarding your property in Harmony Creek." Marcus didn't waste time. He reached into his canvas bag and placed the leather-bound journal on the vast, polished surface of the desk between them. "This belonged to Samuel Miller," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "I believe you know the name." Finch's professional calm faltered for just a second. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes. "He was the station master, I believe. Died in that unfortunate accident." "It wasn't an accident," Marcus said. He opened the journal to the last damning entry and pushed it across the desk. Finch read it. He then read the accompanying letters and the technical reports Samuel Miller had hidden. As he read, the color drained from his face. The corporate mask began to crack, revealing the man beneath, a man who looked cornered and profoundly tired. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the journal. "This is a century-old story," Finch said, his voice losing its smoothness. "Hearsay from a disgruntled employee. It proves nothing." "I think it proves everything," Marcus replied calmly. "And I have made meticulously clear, high-resolution copies. They are in the hands of a third party. If anything were to happen to me, this story would become international news within hours." The two men sat in silence for a long moment, the only sound the quiet hum of the building's climate control. The threat and the insurance policy hung in the air between them. Finch looked out the window at the city his family had helped build. When he finally spoke, his voice was different. The defensiveness was gone, replaced by a deep, hollow resignation. "You know," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "I always wondered. My father, he never spoke of his grandfather. There was a portrait of him in our old house, and if you ever asked about it, my father would just change the subject. It was a ghost, a silent ghost in every room. We built an empire on a foundation of silence." He looked back at Marcus, and for the first time, Marcus saw not a corporate titan, but a man crushed by the weight of his own legacy. "In a way," Finch admitted, a bitter, exhausted look on his face, "it is a relief. It is a relief for the silence to finally be broken. It has been a burden we have carried for too long." "A crime like this can't be undone," Marcus said, "but the damage it caused can be mended. Your family's legacy in Harmony Creek isn't just this secret. It's a dying town, a town your family built and then abandoned." And so they made a deal, not a blackmail payment, but an act of restorative justice. A year later, the sun shone brightly on a crowd of people gathered in front of the old station. But it was not old anymore. The stone had been cleaned, the grand windows replaced, the roof repaired. A new, polished brass sign gleamed above the entrance. The Miller Blackwood Community Health Center. The building was alive again, its halls filled not with the ghosts of departures, but with the promise of healing. The entire town was there. Mr. Abernathy, looking proud in his best tweed jacket, stood at a small podium. "For decades," he said, his voice trembling with emotion, "this station was a symbol of what we had lost. It was a beautiful empty shell that reminded us of a better time. We looked at it and saw only the past. But Marcus Thorne came to us, a stranger carrying the legacy of one of our own, and he looked at this empty shell and saw the future." He looked directly at Marcus, who stood quietly at the edge of the crowd with Scout by his side. "He did more than just repair a building. He honored our history, and in doing so, he has given us back our soul." The applause was thunderous. Later, after the speeches and the ribbon cutting, Marcus stood by the entrance, watching the people of Harmony Creek stream into the clinic. He saw a young mother with her child, an elderly couple leaning on each other for support, a teenager with a broken arm. They were walking into a place of care, a place of hope. He saw their faces, and in them he saw the ghostly images of the soldiers he had lost, the young men with so much future ahead of them whose lives had been cut short. For years, their memory had been a source of unbearable pain, a testament to his failure. But now, something shifted. Watching the living being healed in this place, built on a foundation of truth, the pain began to recede. It was replaced by a quiet, profound sense of peace. He couldn't bring back the dead, but he could honor them by serving the living. He was still a medic. His mission had just changed. The station was no longer a tomb, it was a sanctuary. Scout nudged his hand, and Marcus looked down at his loyal, fearless guide, the true catalyst of this entire journey. He knelt and wrapped his arms around the dog's neck. He looked up at the names on the new sign. Miller and Blackwood, two families, two histories, finally intertwined in an act of justice and redemption. The ghosts were finally at peace, and so was he. It's a beautiful truth that sometimes the mission we take on to heal the wounds of the past for others is the very one that ends up healing our own. The story of Marcus and Scout reminds us that the quiet, unwavering loyalty of a true friend can be the only compass we need to find our way home. If this tale of justice and healing brought you a sense of warmth, we hope you'll consider sharing that feeling with others who might need it. Every subscription and comment helps these stories find a new home. Our next journey is waiting for you right on the screen, and we would be honored if you joined us for it.